David Dean is the author of An Inbox Between Us, and he spends his time helping enterprise leaders separate AI reality from AI mythology. And after nearly 20 years navigating complex organizations, he's learned that the most interesting thing about automation isn't the technology, it's the human behavior it exposes. Now, David, before we get into the book itself, we'll talk about that later. You said something when we were preparing for today that felt just provocative enough to stick with me. You said that writing and launching a book is really a form of product management. Now, so that's a pretty dangerous thing to say in a room full of product managers because we know what
Sure.
comes next. It's you start talking about trade-offs and compromises and launch decisions and that you second guess later on. But as you were writing your book, An Inbox Between Us, how did that idea take shape for you and how did it influence the way you approach the book?
Yeah, so I've been doing this not realizing I was writing the book over an extended period of time because this book is a compilation of digital journals.
Mm-hmm.
As I've been a professional as a solutions architect and a consultant for many years at that point, and moving into the AI realm, I was like, how do I explain this to people? So I was writing my own notes, like, well, how do I explain it to myself? And I'm a very practical person and very realistic. So I was like, how can I make this real? And so I was just over like a year and a half, I had this accumulation of my personal opinions and thoughts around all of this. And then I started looking at like kind of what's being put out there relating to AI and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, there is something here that needs to be told. People need to hear this. And I float around the idea of putting together a book. I've never written a book at all with it. And and essentially at this point it was kind of a collection of white papers if you really want to think about it. And I'm like, I think people need to gravitate to something around reality when it comes to AI. So I decided to pull the trigger and start making it happen, and organizing, putting it together. I had to write a bunch of additional material relating to it, but I really had most of the concepts figured out. In fact, I had to cut out a bunch of stuff of it because I had too much content. So, and that's kind of where it got me started, and then started diving into the world of, launching a book.
Mm-hmm. So, and as that, so very clearly, you identified what you perceive to be a gap in the market, and so this
Yeah.
is something that needs to be filled.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had your possibilities of ways to solve it. Tell me more about that. So, how did, as you went about going through the process, as you were
Mhm.
going through the process, what are some of the things that kind of went through your mind as you started to identify it more as more of a product development, product management process? What are the trade-offs that you started thinking about?
Yeah, I think I knew who my audience was going to be, but I didn't want to ignore other audiences as a part of this.
Mhm.
And so I had found that I had to consistently reevaluate the message and material throughout the entire process to stay focused on that audience, with it. And but I also had constraints. It was a little bit different for me in comparison because I'm publishing a nonfiction book, out there relating to a material. And and I also had to research a bunch of things like, I want to make myself unique. I want to make the voice unique relating to this. And so I wanted to isolate myself and isolating the message with it. And and once I kind of identified what that is and going through that transition with it, then I needed to organize how I needed the delivery. Like,
Mhm.
what did I wanted to get from A to B to C as a part of this? The outcome. What is the summer like? Bringing it all together. What does
Mhm.
that mean?
Mhm.
What are people going to walk away with? But then I also had real constraints because I wrote this independently of my current employer right now, with it. So this is all me, it has nothing to do with anybody I'm affiliated with. And so there are constraints that I had to figure out, like I cannot include certain things in this because of that. So then there's certain stuff that I was not able to include in the content that I may have wanted to include as a part of this. But really, most of the content was focused on like this thought process,
Mhm.
of how I want to deliver because my goal was the message.
Hmm.
That's what I wanted. I wanted to get the message out to people. And I was able to be, in my opinion, successful crafting that message and getting it put into the pages as a part of this. So, but it was interesting as I was finishing up the book. I'm like, oh, I'll just write the book. I'll put all this stuff together and I'll organize it. Then I start getting into the craft, of
Hmm.
that, of it. And I think the hardest thing is when I had to make some hard choices of this because the investor is in all reality myself, or
Hmm.
I'd like to say my spouse. I was like, honey, I want to do this, but we're going to have to make some hard choices because I'm going to need money to make this happen, with it. And so we worked it out, and but then that money only goes so far. And this is more how I learned about the business of writing and delivering a book with it. And so you kind of have to pick and choose what you're going to do before you from your whole launch plan with
Hmm.
it. So um, I made some sacrifices in the book in order to focus on what mattered to me the most, which is marketing and the message. And that's where my most of my focus and funding went to, is to be able to get that message out. And but I had to sacrifice certain capabilities in the book in order to be able to make that happen. I do want to come back and correct some of those things with it, but you sometimes just have to make those hard decisions based on what you have available to you.
So you're already thinking about a second edition or a 2.0 if you want to align
Right.
it to software development. Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very happy with, as I said, the messaging and the content with it. I think the mechanics, because like for example, editing, that's part of the issue where like, I'm not the best editor in the world relating to this, and especially it being a book of a bunch of journals,
Hmm.
writing and speaking are really two different things when it comes to delivery with this. So the book a lot of times sounds like like me kind of having a conversation with people, which is kind of the goal that I wanted to, but the writing mechanics are very different when someone's physically reading it. So I would like to eventually come back and kind of restructure, not
Hmm.
change the content, just restructure some of the language so it's easier to consume. However, I do have an audiobook version coming out, and it'll be interesting on how well that's received based on how it's currently written.
Yeah, that will be really interesting. Yeah, I saw you saw that. I saw that you mentioned that in kind of our prep thread there.
Yeah.
I want to encourage. We got quite a few people jumping into the Zoom meetup right now. I want to encourage you. Please turn your cameras on. Love you to be here in the room with us, and we're going to give you an opportunity to say hey and introduce yourself in just a moment. I would love to hear who's with us, what has your attention this morning. We're going to stick with David here for a couple more minutes before we get over to that. So, without giving away too much, David, about the details in the book, because we're gonna get into that in a minute, and we're gonna
Hmm.
talk about the book club as well in just a minute.
Hmm.
But speaking as a product manager, is there anything that you shipped that you kind of regret shipping, or are there some things that you cut that you wish you'd kept?
Yeah, so my cover, while I liked my cover, as a part of it, a lot of people didn't connect with it as
Mm.
much. And so I'm actually planning a cover update, with this because I have a number of endorsements that I want to include as a part of this, and I've decided that I'm going to reinvent the cover that kind of more closely aligns with the theme of the book versus what I initially had with it. So that's one thing as a part of it. And because covers sell books
Mm-hmm.
in that regard. As I said, I think I'm going to have more success from the audiobook aspect because a lot of people like to listen to nonfiction
Mm-hmm.
audio versus physically reading a lot of times. The other aspect is that I had to cut some implementation and framework methodologies out of the book, and just because of dynamics as part of from a workplace standpoint, like that was one thing that came up. Is like, how can I take action as a part of these steps with it? And that's really was secondary to me. It was more of a state of frame of mind is what I was hoping relating to this
Mm-hmm.
and get people kind of conditioned. And but I would have loved to be able to apply some of these things. However, I do have an editorial book review came out and by the Independent Book Review on Monday, and she perfectly captured. She's like, even though it doesn't have, some, common framework steps that you see in a lot of business books, a lot of what David's talking about is common sense and
Mm-hmm.
it's highly relatable. You don't really need it because you already know it,
Hmm.
essentially, with it. And so she's like, even though it doesn't have that, it didn't really need it.
Hmm.
So which I thought was actually a really good insight as a part of this. And so those are some of the things that I kind of wish I'd been able to do.
Very cool. That's great. Yeah, and that's great validation on the choices that you made. So
Hmm.
so market validation, or at least some customer validation. Yeah,
Yeah,
keep
absolutely.
keep tying it all back. So I want to thanks for being here with us today. I'm really looking forward to getting into the book. We're gonna talk in a few minutes about our next book club reading, which is An Inbox Between Us. And Allison will talk about that in a few minutes. But before we get into that, we have got a growing number of folks here in our virtual meetup here on Zoom. Would love, if you're on YouTube, would love you to be joining us in Zoom as well. Head over to productcoffee.com, sign up as a free subscriber, or join as an insider or a premium member, and we would love to have you join us in the Zoom meetup so that you can get to know us directly and spend some time with David and Allison and the whole crew here. Got quite a few people in here. Want to I want to ask some folks to introduce yourselves and tell us today. And what I'll do is I'll just, if your camera's on, I'll specifically call you out and invite you. And if your camera isn't on and you want to talk anyway, just go ahead and raise your virtual hand in Zoom, and we'll pull you up here to the front, even if we can't see you. I know a lot of people are running around taking care of kids in the morning and so on and so forth. But I'm going to start out with Stephen Ricks. Hey, Stephen, welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself to everybody? Tell everybody, who you are, where you are, and what has your attention this morning.
Sure. Hey, I am Stephen Ricks. I'm the director of product at SecureGive. We do church donation management solutions. And honestly, what has my attention this morning is trying to prepare for our upcoming deployment and keep everything rolling. But I needed a break and needed a brain break, so I'm here.
Let's get started with the book itself. I'd love to pose a question to the audience, and I have a poll that I'd like to share. We're going through chats here. There we go. All right, so the chat is up. There's a poll that should have popped on your screen. I'd love to get your answer. We'll give it a few minutes to get folks in there and answering. The question is, when AI was introduced to your team or organization, which best describes what actually happened? Hopefully get some, no, there's some good answers. Okay, fantastic. David, can you see the poll? So you can see the answers.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Awesome. So, as you might expect, it depends and it varies, but we're seeing a good bit of folks answering confusion. That's not a surprise here. I think we're all kind of stumbling through, what does this mean? How does this affect my work? I know that I have been working with AI for at least the last 2 years, if not almost three. In the last 2 months, I would say the amount of information that has hit me and come across my feed and across my attention has perhaps quadrupled. And I don't even know how I can even hold some of the information anymore. So I can feel the confusion point there. A lot of other folks are answering things like it got mostly ignored or worked around. And I think that's another thing that shows up, that skeptic or avoidance piece. And I think one of the things that came through, so with this book, and the reason why we've selected it is it gives us a path to avoiding or addressing, not avoiding, addressing all of those. So I'd like to get us started with a bit about the book itself. So it is called An Inbox Between Us. AI is on the front, and it is in the book, as David mentioned, but it's not the goal of the conversation. It's really about talking through judgment and where judgment actually lies and where we as humans have the most opportunity to connect with the work when we're being asked to add AI into our work, add AI into our team, maybe even have AI as a team member. So I think I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here so we have that information. Cool. Thank you for that. David, thank you so much for being here today. I know we were connecting before this session, and certainly, as some of you may know, we met at Product Camp Phoenix. We had an infamous elevator story. We got stuck on an elevator together. So, the elevator pitch for your book was something that caught my attention. I'd love to hear in your own words what you think is something that organizations misunderstand about their own work, and maybe some ideas for what motivated you to write this book. I know you were talking about it a little bit at the top, but I'd love to maybe restart that again and say, what motivated you to write this book?
So what motivated to write me was I've had the opportunity, I'm from a product management standpoint, I'm more of not a B2B, with it. I would say like I'm more of like, directly to the end user as a part of it because I worked for large organizations and I acted like a consultant inside of organizations around solving internal business problems with it. But I spent most of my career staying in the productivity space, how ultimately everyone behaves and around these different types of things. And I moved positions and moved into, I was in security and infrastructure and support very early in my career, moved into architecture, security architecture, moved into solution development around that. But I was always still close to frontline workers working in that organic ecosystem regularly. And as I moved into solution development, I had the opportunity to build, design, and support like thousands of solutions at this point in my career. And it gave me a unique perspective around this. And as I moved into, as AI became more prevalent and trying to introduce AI to an ecosystem, especially large company wide, it's complicated with it. And so as I was writing my own journals around like how am I going to explain these things to people and around it, and I'm like, well, I'm overthinking it, to a certain degree. What I came to the conclusion initially as I was crafting these journals together was if AI is here to mimic human behavior, then make it human. So the only way we can make it human is to relate to how we behave as humans with it. And so I took that literally, excuse me. And so what does it mean? I have years experience understanding how everyone behaves in a company, in internal collaboration, communication around the organic data that everyone's doing relating to it, enterprise systems with this. So I was like, I'm going to work with that. I'm going to try and explain that. But I need to explain it to myself, as a part of this. So a lot of times, as I said, I was writing these journals to explain it to myself so I can explain it to other people when I did consulting around it. And then it just kind of morphed into something where I was like, there's something cohesive here. There's a story to tell here. And there's a lot of great, people out there that, talk about the opportunity of AI in many different ways. So there's a lot of enthusiasts. There's a lot of people who are anti-AI out there, and they communicate that as a part of this with it. But most of the people out there are talking at a really high level, or they're talking to an executive audience, with it. And it came down to intent, with it. The intent is from a downstream standpoint, I'm going to sell something, as a part of, which is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is with a lot of this messaging that's coming out, 99% of the workforce is what I call an AI survivalist. They are just here to do their jobs. They're being thrown into this situation and no one's writing for them. And I wanted to reach out to them and make it real, for this. And I think the interesting factor is that I've been on several calls with people in the workforce that are in tears because they are afraid that they're not going to have a job a year from now with it and around some of these things.